thank everyone for those wonderful introductions. But my question for tonight is, what is mysticism? What is that shelf of books called the Classics of Western Spirituality that collects all the mystical texts? What does that word still mean? Or, what I'll come back to later, when the Zohar, the prime text of Jewish mysticism, describes God as a silkworm, what could that possibly mean? Now, in the early 1990s, Professor Ewart Cousins, together with Professor Bernie McGinn and Professor Moshe Dale, led a summer seminar in Jerusalem, and most of the participants, all of them my friends, now colleagues, noticed that there were conflicting definitions of mysticism that summer, and many of them have spent the last few decades trying to figure out, if mysticism is one thing, how could there be so many different definitions on the table? Now, this paper actually got started when I gave a class on Gershon Shalom's influential view of Jewish mysticism, and then followed it in later weeks with discussion in mysticism in Emmanuel Levinas, Michael Fishbane, Elie Wiesel, Moshe Idel, and a student asked, what happened to Gershon Shalom? You already told us what mysticism meant. And I answered that Shalom was answering from a romantic point of view, making mysticism palatable for the 20th century, traditional mysticism, and deals with a Neoplatonic hierarchy. And when modern scholars and thinkers write about mysticism, they do so in the idiom of their age. So my question for tonight is, what is mysticism for our age? What does it mean to understand mysticism after the postmodern decline of the subject, after the linguistic turn, and how did academic theology account for these new definitions? Now, 14 years ago, I graduated from Fordham University after mastering the then current debates. My goal is to survey the changes since then, and as any good Fordham theology graduate student, I present models in order to analyze the topic, and then I will offer comparisons. This talk will address 5 different models of how mysticism is conceptualized today. 4 are textual approaches, and 1 is practice. Mysticism is either now presented as text offering a consciousness of God, 2, as a textual way of speaking of our lack of divine presence, 3, as a prophetic call to alleviate suffering, 4, as a form of esoteric writing, and 5, as a meditation technique. Now, the current turn to text has given history a greater role. We no longer call Sufism, Kabbalah, monastic theology as mysticism, and even within each specific religion, we currently write histories of the differences between texts. According to Michel Certeau, the cultural historian, there were 3 periods of mysticism. The monastic period, when the pious contemplated the theological mysteries, the early modern period, when they looked to their own inner experience, and the modern period, when mysticism was used to describe a religion outside of religion. So in late antiquity, we have a language of ascents and apocalypse. In the Middle Ages, there's the use of Neoplatonic language. In the early modern period, there's an internal voice of God. And in the 20th century, there's a discussion of ineffable direct experiences. Michel Certeau also showed that the origin of the term mysticism was to apply to people was only in the early modern period, when a specific group separated themselves from the doctrinal authority and sought an inner authority. The term mysticism, in the modern sense of ineffable, transitory, personal experience of God, first came to be in Unitarian circles. In the 19th century, it was characterized as a form of a religious experience that was the highest form of religion beyond one's own given faith. And in the 20th century, the thinkers James, Otto, Stace, Zahner defined mysticism as ineffable, transitory, passive, and culminating in mystical union. And in recent decades, some have argued that all mysticism is culturally constructed, and this in turn was followed by defenders of the pure, unmediated experience. But now, after the linguistic turn, Mysticism is analyzed as a specific corpus of mystical text, a clear series of books that express what mysticism is. Now, I must digress before the start of the rest of the presentation and pay tribute by emphasizing the approach of Professor Ewan Cousins, my doctoral advisor here at Fordham, who looked at mysticism as a mystical journey, not as mystical union. This new approach he called spirituality, which was then a new word, intending to incorporate the entire spiritual journey. In many ways, this approach was a modernization of the Catholic term ascetic theology, or what Evelyn Underhill called the illuminations of the soul. Cousins summed up his vision of spirituality as the inner dimension of the person. The spiritual core is the deepest center of the person. It is here the person is open to the transcendent realm. And based on this approach, he was instrumental in the editing and publishing of the many volumes of the Classics of Western Spirituality and World Spirituality. The most important point from my paper tonight is that Professor Cousins' approach stands in contrast to everyone we'll be discussing tonight in the ability to empathize with the mystical texts. He wrote, "I propose that we can empathize with mystics even though we ourselves have not had this intense experience, because our consciousness has the potential for such experience." Now that empathy is no longer seen as there, but I must thank him for everything he did for me in the time of the doctorate. So thank you. One other digression. In the 20th century, most of Protestant thought, and in turn its reception in Jewish thought, was dismissive of mysticism. In those days, Catholic ascetic theology was not read. Mysticism was generally removed from the study of theology. Yet in the 1960s, mysticism came back under Karl Rahner, Hans Balthasar, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and others. And now, after the linguistic turn, there's a reintegration of mystical text into theology as a corpus of text, and this may be the greatest contribution of our current era of theology, more than any specific constructions. I repeat, this reintegration of mysticism into theology may be the greatest contribution of our time. Currently, historic theology and the books of mysticism locate mystics in their contexts, which give a deeper understanding of faith and tradition to infuse theology. All the mystical texts have in common, or all the current uses of mystical texts have in common a movement from biblical language to mystical language as a means of expressing theology. And now all create histories of many mystics rather than looking for a common core. And for all of them, there's a distance between us and the original experience, so that we cannot have a direct empathy with it. And even when we do read the mystical text, they become embedded in our own narrative experience. The study of mysticism is more complex now. Academics ask questions about disciplining the body. Critical thinkers are producing new theoretical understandings. Sociologists are spending more time studying contemporary religious phenomena. And I'm not going to analyze these shifts. I would rather want to ask the philosophic, theological question of how this shift affects the role of mysticism in theology, and to present the new theologies. It's important also to note that in the current rubric, rational and mystical are mixed, philosopher and mystics are not opposites, and Jewish and Christian texts are freely mixed in almost everyone I'm discussing. So are Islamic texts, but for time considerations, some they had to give tonight. The significance of this talk is that most of contemporary authors take sides for a specific one of the approaches, or take sides for a specific text or mystic. Several authors cite several of my models, or advocate for only one of them. Instead, my goal is to give them some of the meta talk, and give currently the 5 different models that are out there today. So the first model, mysticism as presence. This first group, centering around the University of Chicago, offers the predominant theological mode for understanding mysticism today. Mysticism is a text that describes God's presence. This includes Bernard McGinn, Mark McIntosh, and Michael Fishbane. Now originally, William James and others made an abstraction of mysticism beyond any text or doctrine. In the current approach, there is no walking away from the concrete. The concrete imagery leads back to the individual experience, but only within one's textual community. Current readings of mystical texts, according to this approach, are embedded in our own narrative experience without the possibility of a simple empathy with the original. Experiences are articulated in text, and these texts in turn become narratives for our own experience. The text is not an afterthought, but the actual place of encounter and transformation. We actually have now, for those in this approach, an aesthetic suspension of any rational judgment to internalize the historic mystical text as a presence of God. This approach is nostalgia for the mystical text. The historian collects the text, but the theologian looks for how these texts speak to us. This approach does not seek unio mystica or an ineffable experience, but rather the beliefs and practices that are a direct preparation for any presence of God. To take Bernard Begin as an example, for him, mystics are not breakaway contemplatives who find their own way to God. They're bearers and interpreters of a common tradition built on a concrete revelation, and mystics do not dabble in private transcendental encounters with God. Mystics have produce texts with linguistic qualities. They produce texts that are the object of study. They produce texts that have paradox, oxymoron, negation. A student of McGinn who deals explicitly with the theological questions is Mark A. McIntosh. And he complains that most of our modern theologians were like artists that have become colorblind. They lost their aesthetics of mysticism. Instead, he sees that these texts will allow people to enter a realm empowered by God, to seek patterns of growth in a community. But McIntosh, still following the Chicago approach, considers mysticism as the patterns, structures, and images that embody God within the text. And a third figure in this approach is Michael Fishbane, once again from the University of Chicago, who sees the exegetical tradition, the tradition of interpreting the Bible, as dealt with in rabbinic texts, became reframed as mysticism, and now we study mystical texts as a resource for our own lives. Mysticism is an understanding of a Bible, and one in turn internalizes the myth. Even if the images are illusional, we accept them as part of a second naivete because they make up the very sights and sounds of human experience. And then Fishbane turns to Hasidic texts to offer strategies for internalizing these medieval texts. That was model number one. Model number two is the model of aphoria or fragmentation. The second approach locates the paradox of the presence of God and the absence of God in modern life. Mysticism overcomes absence of God and at the same time retains a sense of God's distance. Those who fit into this can include thinkers like Dennis Turner, David Tracy, and in some ways Jacques-Luc Marion. In this approach, presence of God is something we lack. Presence is realized in its absence, and mystical discussions are discussions of what we lack in the modern life, how far these texts are different than our current life, about how these texts make it seem that God is unknowable, how the discussions in the mystical text are greater than our lives. And according to this approach, since God is beyond distinctions, especially language, mystics make playful use of language, and therefore the goal is to look at the metaphors used by these mystics. This approach comes in two varieties, saturated and fragmented. The saturated variety, it says that mysticism is so much greater than anything, and we are far from it. The fragmented version is that we lead such fragmented lives that all we can do is talk about God in a negative way, that negative theology can be used. Negative theology can be used to creatively explore our distance from God. So to point this second model out, for Bonaventure, the world really is a mystical hierarchy, and the journey is not a metaphor. For Ewart Cousins is a hierarchy, and therefore symbolism charts the way of the mystical path. For this second model, they say openly, we can't accept the hierarchy, we can't accept the medieval metaphysics, and therefore all we can do is talk about what these texts can teach us about our current distance in the modern life. A variant of this that's actually less located in Chicago and is actually in the East Coast is by the Jewish thinker Arthur Green, the dean of the rabbinical school at Hebrew College, who creates a minimal theology, a theology that's using mystical metaphors to discuss our realm of being far from God. So with one foot in the modern, Arthur Green seeks to create a postmodern spirituality of the heart. But on the other hand, he says the mystical metaphor of tzimtzum, God's contraction, allows us to have a minimal deity, withdrawn from everyday life, because we no longer feel God in everyday life. In the postmodern age, all we can do is have these metaphors. Or as one commenter on Green's approach said, he considers Green's approach naturalism hedged by ignoring Occam's razor, meaning he avoids the traditional metaphors by using mystical texts to create a plausible God. The second approach, gone is the disbelief of the atheist. Rather, the second approach allows one to speak God's name without any specific belief or object. Okay, that was a little far from some, it's a little more technical. The third one is a little straighter. Those who treat mysticism as political. And that's associated with Mary Gray, Elie Wiesel, and most importantly, Emmanuel Levinas. Now, the political approach to mysticism did not just start now. That one is an old genealogy back in the 1920s, when mysticism and social action, mysticism and the social gospel went together. Fell out of fashion for many decades, and has now come back. And now Mary Gray, for example, frames the political approach to mysticism as after the terrors of the Holocaust and modern society's lack of God and the contemporary sense of dread, one uses mysticism as overcoming consumerism and cultural despair. For Mary Gray, God died in Auschwitz, but mysticism is a way to come back to God, and that mystics rise after catastrophe. And the cruelty of this world constitutes a dark night, parallel to the mystics' dark night. Now, Mary Gray is actually the end of a series of authors, and she's influenced by the Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, who already took mystical texts and used them to create a Holocaust theology. Using mystical texts to say we can't use biblical models of God anymore, and therefore we turn to mystical models for a limited God. The important element in this Jewish version is the continued personified God with whom one argues and can continue to demand ethics even as this God seems silent. The mystical version allows hope. And Elie Wiesel writes, since God is God and God is everywhere, does it mean he's also an evil? When God sent the people of Israel into exile, he accompanied them into exile. That's a mystical concept, which, again, has tremendous beauty and emotion. The political approach is using these theologians in order to find mandates for political action in mysticism. But the most important thinker in this group is the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Now, Levinas rejects Neo-Hasidism and the quest for a unified inner experience of most modern Jewish thought, and is sometimes falsely characterized as anti-mystical because he rejects unified experience, but he too uses mystical texts for his own Jewish theology. Levinas reads the Kabbalistic celestial hierarchy as describing man's responsibility to maintain the higher worlds, and that man's actions are to be done in reference to their effects in the higher realms. The great powers of the soul described in the Kabbalah are reinterpreted as giving a hierarchy of meaning to man's soul through reorganizing one's responsibility. Mystical adherence is reinterpreted as reaching an ethical height and adhering to it. Levinas considers this act of pouring out of one's soul an experience of divesting oneself of self-interest and therefore engage in political activity. The metaphors in this case of Levinas and Elie Wiesel are now having an influence in the way people are reading mystical texts. Model number 4 is that mysticism as a style of writing. The fourth model, the esoteric model, treats mysticism as writing and makes the text not a point of meaning God, but the very manner of writing is mysticism. So, for example, Professors Moshe Idel and Moshe Halbertal write about mysticism as a form of this word they coined, arcanization, of finding esoteric meaning in texts. Don Cuppett from Britain makes the very act of writing a mystical text into a private form of the mystical. And Jeffrey Kripa examines mysticism as the beginning of bringing the esoteric of the self into writing. So to do a little bit on this approach, Moshe Idel, professor at Hebrew University, formulates Kabbalah as a tradition of esoteric knowledge read into the biblical text. Mystical texts offer a map that one can become familiar with. Mysticism is about detailed knowledge. And Idel quotes Umberto Eco, the professor of semiotics, saying mysticism is an exegetical code to unlock a text. The goal of mysticism is to explain texts. For Idel, there are a variety of methods used, including, as he says, arcanization, semantic hermeneutics, numerology, mutability of letters, and prophetic inspiration. And that's what mysticism is. This approach downplays negative theology, so in some way it's the opposite of approaches 2 and 3. It downplays the unknowability of God, and the secrets of the text are an end in and of themselves. For this approach, for all that it's dealing now with postmodern issues, in many ways it's a return to the 17th century, when mysticism was seen as hieroglyphics, Kabbalah, and secret knowledge that Leibniz tried so hard to discredit, calling it that only a Kabbal knew this Kabbalistic knowledge. In this approach, Kabbalah is esoteric reading of texts. But this approach is not just in academia. The Kabbalah Center has been making the news, and the Kabbalah Center all over the streets of New York and LA and everywhere else also makes esotericism as a sign of authority. They have the secrets of the universe. They offer knowledge not available to anywhere else, and they're going to give you this textual knowledge if you buy their set of books for at least $500, but they possess this knowledge. It is also by a lot of contemporary ultra-Orthodox Kabbalists and a lot of those who seek mystical prophecy in America, who say that mysticism is any true meaning of the universe and that science is wrong. They also are part of this approach. A different thinker of this approach is Don Cuppett in his defining work, Mysticism After Modernity. And he states that mysticism is a tradition of devotional writing which commonly uses the language of the Neoplatonists and is consciously paradoxical. But Cuppett points out that mystical writing becomes an end in itself, and that mysticism is important not because it's experiential, but because it's alternative. It's against the system. You get to say, I have a mystical knowledge, and therefore whatever house of worship I belong to doesn't. It's a way of saying, I have a special book that the others don't. And he thinks the purpose of this is to create a certain form of mystical happiness, and that if you take this stance, this countercultural stance, or you write these books, it will lead to a certain peace of your soul. A variant of this, and I bring this out because this will be important later, is Jeffrey Kripal takes Culpett's view and says, no, there still is some mystery to mysticism. And the fact that even though you're writing these books against the system, you're still revealing something about the self. Mysticism is in some way still somewhat autobiographical, still in some way revealing the self. And for someone to get up there and say, I have this book of knowledge that you don't have, says a lot about them, probably more than anything else. The fifth and final model is the model of meditation and contemplation. This fifth approach treats mysticism as a practice of meditation. Now, under the broad influence of Buddhist meditation in Western culture, the category of meditation has returned. This one says you treat mysticism as something one does. So, for example, Professor Mary Carruthers of NYU, writing about contemplative reading in medieval Christianity, says that the meditation approach is orthoprax. It's about correct practice. Christian mystics sought not a doctrine of God, but a regimen of regular devotional reading, a regimen of regular meditation. In this approach, God is an object of contemplation. And the best definition for this approach is by Jess Hollenbach, who says that mysticism, in whatever form it takes, is a concentrated recollection or contemplation. The inner silence that mystics cultivate cannot develop unless the individual first learns how to tightly focus his or her attention so that the mind and imagination no longer wander aimlessly from one object, thought, or feeling state to another. When this mental background noise ceases as a consequence of the mystic's successful endeavors, a dramatic change occurs in the mystic's mode of consciousness. For many contemporary American mystics and meditators, this approach is combined with the influence now of neurotheology, of now saying we're hardwired for mysticism. It's being combined with transpersonal psychology and integral psychology. Or to give an example from the transpersonal psychologist Ken Wilber, he uses St. Bonaventure's terminology of the three eyes of knowing, eyes of flesh, eyes of reason, and eyes of contemplation. And he says that through regular practice in meditation, and in his case he's arguing for Buddhist meditation, will move you from flesh to reason to contemplation. Now, as of 2008, there has yet to emerge a major mystical theologian of meditation and practice for Judaism or Christian theology, and most who read medieval mysticism as practiced are still relying on adapting Buddhist books. And I was surprised because most survey books of mysticism today include chapters on Buddhism without ever giving a justification for this broad category of mysticism as practice. And I'm not going to deal with the writings of the Dalai Lama from Tibetan Buddhism, but I found more than his share of quotes in books on medieval Catholic mysticism from him in the introductions. An immediate application of this approach are works like the Centering Prayer of Thomas Keating, who wants to recreate a Christian meditation as a form of prayerful reflection using thoughts and images. On the Jewish side, coming back to Professor Moshe Idel, he's giving a whole catalog of Jewish states of meditation, chanting, mandalas, visualization, color visions, circle visions, various forms of ascent. and finds mystical practice everywhere. But in the end, he defines mysticism as a radical reorganization of being by transcending ordinary experience. He is separating the conjoined things in order to reach the mystical state. But since he avoids psychology, he avoids empathy, he reads numerological statements as qualifying for this mystical reorientation, and therefore it has not led many on the Jewish side yet to give a theology that incorporates practice. But once again, I must point out that this fifth model also has contemporary practitioners. So at least on the Jewish side, there are traditional Kabbalists like Rabbi Yitzhak Morgenstern, a descendant of the Kotzker Rebbe, are currently practicing Kabbalistic doctrine as a process of meditation, starting with sitting, breathing, visualizing lights, mental visualizations. His style, even though he lives in the ultra-Orthodox world, shows that he's picked up at least some introductory meditation manuals of either Hinduism or Buddhism. So too, and I'm not going to speak about his political theories, the political Kabbalist Yitzhak Ginsburg offers meditations that are forms of contemplations or set practices. It must be noted that I didn't speak about the body and gender tonight, because to include questions of the body would have been an entirely different paper. It is also noted that I didn't deal with spirituality tonight. Contemporary spirituality is best analyzed using functional applications of some mystical ideas, but it's basically about contemporary functional needs. The way spirituality is now used in our decade, it tends to be a sociological category about functionality. So for example, Robert Wuthnow notes that spirituality helps us create meaning and moral order of our lives. Or Charles Taylor says that religion today creates a continuing multiplication of new options which individuals seize on in order to make sense of their lives. Or to speak from personal experience, I was invited about 2 years ago to speak on mysticism, to speak about mystical texts. So I come in with my photocopies of medieval texts, and they go to me, "No, Rabbi, that's not what we wanted. We thought you were going to speak about mysticism, everyday life, a purpose-driven life. Tell us how to raise our children, that you're going to take out a guitar, that you're going to tell us stories." The way mysticism is being used in this decade is not the way, or the way spirituality is being used in this decade is not the way it was used when the classics of Western spirituality chose the word spirituality. There is no introduction to these about the purpose-driven life and how music will help you. If we compare the new definitions to the older definitions, we see there's no unio mystica for any of them, and only the fifth approach still has a path. So there are a few questions about how do they handle things differently, but first I'll give an example of a text. To use a Kabbalistic text as an example, the modernists in a text like the Zohar sought mystical union. The first model now looks for the metaphors, the garments of God, the silkworm imagery, the colored lights. The second model picks out from the text darkness, contraction, limited of God, how inaccessible it is. The third model turns hierarchy into responsibility. The fourth model asks, how was the text written? What is read into the text? What authority it claims? And the fifth model, the contemplative model, tries to pick out actual instructions or disciplines. And now for some comparisons. If in the current age, the current after modernity, we feel distant from the original text, how does this play itself out? The first model, under Bernard McGinn, says we can never return to the original experience at all. For him, the role of texts is solely something now within the 21st century. But others, following the highly influential scholar Michael Sells, a scholar of Islamic mysticism, says that no, mystical texts still serve as meaning events. There is no access to the original experience, but the text still offers us new realms of meaning in which a certain amount of the semantic range of the text can be communicated, and therefore one can still make linguistic parallels between pagan, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish texts because the meaning is in the texts. The esoteric model, the written model, sees that everything is in private text, and everyone is about how one reads something into the text, but it doesn't at all convey anything about an original meaning. If anything, it only conveys something about the reader. And finally, for the contemplatives, there's still enough similarities in practice, but in practice, to be able to compare one to the next. What about now, after modernity and the postmodern age? We use this language of indeterminacy, deconstructionism, there's nothing solid anymore. For McGinn and everyone in the first model, there's no indeterminacy because everything is guaranteed by God. God is the ground behind the text, and therefore there's still meaning. The second model of distance from God says no, indeterminacy and lack of meaning is great. And that as postmoderns, we love mystics because we're allowed to do whatever we want with the text in order to deal with our own distance from God. The political model doesn't look at the literary postmodern, but looks at postmodern literature. For those seeking the political understanding of mysticism, they'll cite modern contemporary novels like Don DeLillo's sense of an indeterminate fear, a white noise in our lives, something that creates a general sense of dread, and say that's what the mystics shared with us. For the esoteric model, the texts are indeterminate because you could have endless amount of esoteric reads of the text, and that there's no limit to what the text could possibly mean. So, for example, Moshe Bell will then take, when the Talmud says there are 70 facets to Torah, he says that can mean 7,000 or 7 million. There's no clear limit. And the contemplative model rejects indeterminacy entirely. No, there's a very clear path that we're all still on. Where does one look for inspiration if one's reading a medieval text, backwards or forwards? Some look back to Scripture, but most will look to the early modern period in which texts were now seen as individual voices, as something that is no longer connected to medieval hierarchies. So in wrapping up, is there still a mystery to mysticism after modernity? For the present and aphoric models, since mysticism is linguistic, there is no ineffable mystery, no seeking a mystery. For minimal theology, like Arthur Green, it's a theological evasiveness of seeking inner experiences, but at the same time not taking them too seriously. For the esoteric model, the mystery is an esoteric body of knowledge, or a mysterious form of writing that only the mystic has. It's a private language. And for the contemplative model, the mystery has been made routine in a process of meditation. One more question. Without self, can one still have mysticism? Meaning now that the self is also seen as a construct by many, can there still be a mystery to mysticism after the self? Well, I can throw that question in a different way. Is there still a mystery to psychology in general? The category mysticism came to be at the 20th century when James and Freud were exposing mysterious unconscious, and poets sought to capture stream of consciousness. Now, after a century of psychology, confessional poetry, introspective novels, and talk shows about dysfunctionality, we've exposed much of the inner self. Mysticism is now, as much of psychology, located in texts and practices, and one looks to the entire shelf of mystical works and mystical manuals to help describe experiences that are seen as common. Can we still create a broad transhistoric category called mysticism after modernity? Well, yes and no. As a writing style, one can still collect many different texts, but now one always still separates them out by history, philosophy, and culture. And therefore, there is no clear corpus with a clear closure. So, for example, on the Christian side, Bernie McGinn leaves out visionaries because they don't fit his model. And on the Jewish side, Moshe Idel leaves out love poetry because they don't fit his model. So does Bonaventure have anything to do with Brother Lawrence? Does Zohar have anything to do with Hasidism? Personally, I'm historicist, and that even though William James has little to do with the Dalai Lama from a historicist point of view, but transhistorically he does. There clearly still is a certain type of text, a certain type of textual model that they work with. So in conclusion, this paper is a snapshot of an era of the last decade. Most of the authors discussed are still active. Their thoughts are still being reviewed, and some of them still have forthcoming books, and even one of the authors mentioned even just put out a book last week. In the last 12 years after a historic and linguistic turn, there is no more ineffability, no more experience. In contrast to Professor Cousins' approach, there's no more empathy, no more universal, no more looking for union symbols. We've had a linguistic turn in which literary texts are taken as a resource unto themselves. We look at the text not as a path, but as a resource of images, symbols, and constructed lives still useful for today. Religious experience is moved aside for a series of rhetorical structures, writing structures, and practice. And I want to finish with a comparison of the spider and the silkworm. In Ingrid Bergman's modernist 1950s film, Through a Glass Darkly, the protagonist perceives visions of God as a spider. The movie ponders the nature of the experience itself. Is it real? Is she delusional? Is all religion delusional? Is everything centered on personal experience? Can we ever get to the experience behind the image? Is God really behind the spider? It's all looking to get behind the image. In contrast, today I use the image of the Zohar, in which there's an image of God as a silkworm spinning out the world. The image is fixed in the text. After modernity, we no longer ask about the original experience. We ask, what does the image contribute to contemporary religious life? What other images and texts can be used? How will the community use the image of the silkworm? How is that image read into the biblical text? Or how does one make it into a practice as part of one's life? Mystical texts have thousands of images, and the new question after modernity is how do these images and texts help us weave theological lives?